In Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, he argued, "The cartoon is a vacuum into which our identity and awareness are pulled, an empty shell that we inhabit, which enables us to travel in another realm. We don't just observe the cartoon, we become it. You give me life by reading this book and filling up this very iconic, cartoony form. Who am I is irrelevant, I'm just a little piece of you. But if who I am matters less, maybe what I say will matter more." That's the theory anyway. As an audience, our imagination is often activated differently between mediums because different media produces different levels of concentration and therefore requires different forms of engagement. In the case of comic books, we project our own voices, sense of motion and time to the movement and meaning of every panel. While film, these are all set and carefully controlled. We are merely observers as opposed to facilitators of action and life. But what happens when you adapt a comic into a film so closely that the differences aren't in the narrative content, well, minus one thing, but are from the shockwaves from the differences of the mediums themselves? Beyond the squid, what are the most profound differences between Watchmen as a comic and Watchmen as a film? And yeah, that's I can't think of any other way to end. Within comic books, the space between panels innately invite the reader to interpret, personalize, and project. Watchmen takes advantage of this by featuring characters that walk a very precarious line between being pathetic and heroic. Superheroes in this story are not idealized paragons, but are sad creatures that are unflattering and impotent. Night Owl is someone who puts on the costume because there's a sexual frustration inside him. Rorschach is a superhero because he's a barely functioning member of society and he has a very, very painful and dysfunctional relationship with his own personal social values and with violence.
There is that element of, wouldn't these characters be a joke? Wouldn't these characters be somehow kind of sad and touching?
These characters could have been portrayed as either being very repulsive or oddly idealistic, but instead, they're sympathetic in a deeply bittersweet way because a large part of the intimacy of the medium allows us to connect with them without judgment. We don't listen to their thoughts, we voice them ourselves. What gives them life is our empathy. Alan Moore directly plays with this interpretive effort because the story itself is about the limits of human interpretation. The story begins as a murder mystery. The main point of view character is literally called Rorschach. Dr. Manhattan's story is focused on him losing his capacity to empathize with humanity because of the scope of his point of view is so far beyond the realms of an ordinary human. And the last line of the story is literally, "I leave it entirely in your hands." Does Veidt's utopia work? Was it ethical? And is there any objectivity to morality, or is it merely a symptom of our own personal traumas? Human interpretation is the subject of the story, an awareness test for the reader and a statement of the comic book medium itself. Film, conversely, isn't as polysemic. Often it involves more comprehension from the audience than interpretation, because elements such as pacing, tone, and emotional focus aren't inferred but are actually overtly controlled by the directors and editors. Therefore, the audience is placed into a different level of involvement. It's more passive.
Whatever. Take some initiative. Run whatever you like. Leave it entirely in your hands.
It's less about empathy and more sympathy. And in Zack Snyder's Watchmen, despite how hard he tried to preserve as much of the contents from the comic, which includes every narrative beat, most of the dialogue, and some of the very images, the innate quality of the medium is still largely felt because new choices are made within the extra modes of communication, from music to the direction of the performances.
Damn. It's been too long.
As a result, Zack Snyder's auteurist imprint is immediately felt. Everyone is less bittersweet and more just cool.
I don't like what you're implying. And I like being followed even less.
Night Owl stands up to Rorschach. Veidt isn't a jolly man, but is like a Bond villain straight away. Laurie isn't in tears when she shoots Veidt, but looks more irritated.
Such an asshole.
The violence itself is now distractingly awesome, because everyone has super durability and kung fu powers. Consequently, faithfulness does not mean the full transportation of content, because the new presentational qualities doesn't just change the level of intimacy or activity from the audience, but actually changes the very values and pronouncements of everything. You don't notice it, but you can feel it. From the end of the storyteller, much of the contents are the same, while from the end of the audience, it's different. Especially with the new ending. There's more subtle differences, but the rationale behind most of these changes come from the desire to compress the information down so everything is more direct, and is less dependent on its simmering. And this impacts the ending the most. The original Watchmen featured Ozymandias teleporting a massive squid destroying New York, killing millions of innocent people with horrible visions, and therefore fooling all the world's nations to unite. This reveal is a product of a very slowly developing periphery subplot involving a mystery of missing artists, writers, and scientists. And the fallout is supposed to feel as shocking and foreign as possible from the rest of the story. It is as alien to the characters as it is for us. As a climax for the comic, it tests and pushes the reader right into the very limits of human interpretation. In the film, the sign squid was changed to Dr. Manhattan.
In an act of evil perpetrated by Dr. Manhattan himself.
It cut out what could have been an additional 20-minute long subplot. It makes the overall story more tighter because he's more explicitly relevant to the rest of the story.
I've saved the Earth from hell. We both have. This is as much your victory as it is mine.
It's an extremely functional change because you're not risking pissing off an impatient wide audience. But this new ending actively goes back and creates new patterns in the story that weren't previously thematically related.
I tell her I don't think there is a God, and if there is, I'm nothing like him.
First, the overarching exploration of how limited human interpretation really is, which is shared by both the characters and the reader, are now less pronounced. The world no longer unite under the fear of the unknown, they unite under a threat from within. Secondly, the ideological and religious consequences of Dr. Manhattan has been intensified far more than the original text. He's no longer a man with the perspective of a god, he's now definitively a god with the perspective of a man. And finally, this then contributes to drawing a more distinguished line between these characters from ordinary people.
Never compromise. Not even in the face of Armageddon.
As an audience, we no longer share our views with them so vulnerably, we now look up to them. They are sharply idealized. Unlike the comic, no one is paralyzed by the horror of the death of millions. Instead, they're angry. They are not tragic people in costumes that are as emotionally vulnerable as anyone else. The Watchmen are actually superheroes, to the extent that Dr. Manhattan's last words from the comic are even given to Laurie now.
I know John would say, nothing ends. Nothing ever ends.
And in doing so, the final image we have of Veidt isn't him being disempowered by the ambiguity of these words. Instead, it's a romantic and tragic image of him standing alone as Dan and Laurie leaves him. The focus isn't on the feeling of ambiguity which the reader in Veidt feels and are powerless to, but is on Veidt himself. Therefore, his twist is almost reversed. Instead of the warm and likable Veidt who turns out to be a Machiavellian orchestrator, now he's instead very clearly a villain who's revealed to actually have very altruistic motives.
Dad, a world united and at peace, there had to be sacrificed.
No!
In summary, both Watchmen, the comic, and the film contain largely the same story, but in one you sympathize with the contents with a top-down perspective, and another you empathize from a bottom-up one. The original comic was about looking into the future through the limits of the old, from the characters to the in-universe documents to the fact that you're reading a comic book, which is a distinctly piece of old media, while the film is about looking at the past through the lens of the modern and being able to meditate over what everything is in a more empowered position. So I think it's immensely important to recognize that every story is co-constructed between the storyteller and the medium itself. The medium influences the very terms and conditions of everything. It's an invisible messenger, if you will.
First.
Warshak!
Daniel, Miss Jupiter, excuse me. Have to visit men's room.
Oh, for Christ.